The soft hum of computers filled the 42nd floor of the NexTech Solutions building as Samantha Williams worked late into the evening, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced precision. At 34, she had spent the last 8 years climbing the ranks at the tech company she had helped build from the ground up. As Senior Vice President of Product Development, she was responsible for the innovative software solutions that had made NexTech a household name in the industry. But tonight felt different. Word had been spreading through the office for weeks about the impending acquisition. NexTech, once a scrappy startup she had co-founded with her college roommate, was being bought out by Titan Industries, a massive conglomerate known for its aggressive cost-cutting measures and corporate restructuring. Samantha glanced at the framed photo on her desk, herself and her late business partner, Jennifer Chen, celebrating their first $1 million contract 5 years ago. Jennifer had passed away from cancer 2 years prior, leaving Samantha as the sole remaining co-founder still with the company. What most people didn't know was that Jennifer had left her shares to Samantha in her will, shares that represented a significant portion of the company's ownership. The elevator chimed softly in the distance, and Samantha looked up from her screen. It was past 9 p.m. She hadn't expected anyone else to be in the office. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, accompanied by voices she didn't recognize. "This floor needs to be completely restructured," a man's voice carried through the air, authoritative and dismissive. "Too much overhead. Too many unnecessary positions. We'll cut at least 40% of the staff by the end of the month." Samantha's stomach tightened. She had heard rumors about the new owner, but this was her first indication of just how dramatic the changes would be. "What about the development team?" another voice asked. "They're responsible for most of our core products." "Products are fine," the first voice replied coldly. "But we don't need half the people we have creating them. Efficiency, gentlemen. That's how you turn a good company into a great one." The voices grew closer, and Samantha quickly saved her work, gathering her things. She didn't want to be caught eavesdropping, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that her world was about to change dramatically. The next morning arrived with an energy that felt different from the usual bustle of NexTech's offices. Employees huddled in small groups, whispering about the changes they'd heard were coming. The coffee stations buzzed with nervous chatter, and productivity seemed to take a back seat to anxiety. At precisely 10 a.m., an email blast went out to the entire company. "Mandatory all-hands meeting, conference room A, 11 a.m." Samantha read the message twice, her chest tightening with each word. She had been through corporate restructuring before, but never as someone with so much invested in the outcome. Conference room A was packed beyond capacity when Samantha arrived. Employees lined the walls, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. At the front of the room stood a man she had only seen in business magazines, Marcus Kane, the billionaire CEO of Titan Industries. At 45, Kane exuded the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. His tailored suit probably cost more than most employees made in a month, and his steel-gray eyes scanned the room with the calculating gaze of someone who saw people as numbers on a spreadsheet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kane began, his voice filling the room without the aid of a microphone, "I'm sure you've all heard that Titan Industries has acquired NexTech Solutions. I'm here today to outline the changes that will ensure this company's continued success and profitability." He clicked a remote, and a presentation appeared on the large screen behind him. The first slide read, "Operational efficiency through strategic reduction. NexTech has been operating with significant redundancy," Kane continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "While the company has shown innovation, it has lacked the disciplined approach necessary for sustained growth. That changes today." Samantha felt her jaw clench. Redundancy? She had personally overseen the development of 3 of their most successful products, managing teams that worked around the clock to meet impossible deadlines. "Over the next 2 weeks, we will be implementing a comprehensive restructuring plan. This will involve the elimination of positions that do not directly contribute to our core revenue streams." Kane's eyes swept across the room, lingering on no one in particular. "For those whose positions are eliminated, we appreciate your contributions to the company and will provide standard severance packages." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Standard severance packages were notoriously minimal in the tech industry, barely enough to cover expenses while searching for new employment. Kane clicked to the next slide. Immediate terminations. Effective today. A list of names appeared on the screen, and Samantha's heart stopped. Her name was third from the top. The following individuals should report to HR immediately to begin the separation process, Kane announced, reading through the list with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for a grocery list. Samantha Williams, Vice President of Product Development. The room fell silent. Samantha felt dozens of eyes turn toward her, their expressions a mixture of shock and sympathy. She had been with the company longer than almost anyone in the room. Her products generated millions in revenue. Her teams respected and trusted her leadership, and Marcus Kane had just eliminated her position without so much as a conversation. Samantha stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Around her, colleagues whispered their disbelief, but she barely heard them. Her mind was racing, calculating, processing what had just happened and what it meant for her future. Miss Williams, Kane's voice cut through her thoughts. HR is waiting for you on the 38th floor. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze direct. There was no recognition in his eyes, no acknowledgement that he was speaking to someone who had helped build the company he had just purchased. To him, she was simply a line item to be removed. I understand, Samantha replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. I'll be right there. As she walked toward the exit, her colleague David Chen, Jennifer's younger brother who had joined the company 2 years ago, caught her arm. Sam, this is insane. You can't let them do this. Samantha paused, looking back at the room full of people she had worked alongside for years. Many of them were likely to face the same fate in the coming days. Sometimes, she said quietly, people have to learn things the hard way. The HR meeting was brief and humiliating. Samantha was escorted to her office by security while she packed her personal belongings into a cardboard box. 8 years of work, countless late nights, innovative breakthroughs that had defined the company's success, all reduced to a few photos, a coffee mug, and a small plant that had survived in her windowless office. Marcus Kane appeared in her doorway as she was packing the last of her things. Miss Williams, he said, his tone carrying a hint of what might have been sympathy. I want you to know this isn't personal. It's simply business. Samantha looked up from the box, studying his face. Mr. Kane, may I ask if you've reviewed my contribution to this company's success? He shrugged. I've reviewed the organizational chart and the budget. Your position represents significant cost savings with minimal impact on operations. Minimal impact, Samantha repeated, her voice thoughtful. That's an interesting perspective. Kane checked his expensive watch, clearly eager to move on to other matters. Your severance package includes 4 weeks of pay and continuation of benefits for 60 days. That's quite generous, considering. Considering what? Considering that most companies would provide only 2 weeks. Kane's expression suggested he expected gratitude for his magnanimity. Samantha closed the box and picked it up, balancing it against her hip. Mr. Kane, I have one question for you. What's that? Have you read the company's articles of incorporation, the ownership structure, the shareholder agreements? Kane's brow furrowed slightly. My legal team handled the acquisition details. I focus on operational strategy. Samantha nodded slowly. That's what I thought. She walked past him toward the elevator, then paused and turned back. You might want to ask your legal team to review those documents again, particularly the section about shareholder voting rights and board representation. Kane stared after her as the elevator doors closed, but Samantha could see the first hint of uncertainty creeping into his expression. That evening, Samantha sat in her home office, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements that she hadn't needed to review in years. Jennifer's will was clear and legally binding. Upon her death, her 30% ownership stake in NexTech Solutions would transfer to Samantha Williams, along with all associated voting rights and board representation. When NexTech had been sold to Titan Industries, that ownership stake had been converted to equity in the merged company. Marcus Kane owned 51% of the new entity, but Samantha owned 30%, making her the second-largest shareholder and giving her significant influence over company operations. More importantly, according to the merger agreement, any operational changes affecting more than 25% of the workforce required approval from shareholders representing at least 60% of the company's equity. Kane's 51% wasn't enough. He needed her vote, and he had just fired her without realizing who she was. Samantha picked up her phone and dialed the number for the company's law firm. It was time to schedule a board meeting. The conference room on the 45th floor of the NexTech building was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while a polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room. Marcus Kane sat at the head of the table, flanked by his team of attorneys and financial advisors. He had been in a foul mood since receiving the request for an emergency board meeting from an anonymous shareholder. His legal team had spent the morning scrambling to identify who could possibly have the authority to call such a meeting, and their findings had been deeply unsettling. "Explain to me again how we missed this," Kane demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. His lead attorney, Patricia Morse, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The ownership transfer was handled by the previous company's legal team. Jennifer Chen's estate planning documents were filed with the court, but the beneficiary information wasn't prominently featured in our initial due diligence. "So you're telling me that someone owns 30% of my company, and I don't know who they are?" "We know who they are," Morse replied carefully. "We just didn't realize the significance until now." The conference room door opened, and Samantha Williams walked in, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a sharp business suit that commanded attention. Behind her walked David Chen, who had apparently taken a personal day to attend the meeting. Marcus Kane's face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, recognition, and finally, a dawning horror, as the pieces fell into place. "Miss Williams," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" Samantha took a seat at the opposite end of the table, directly facing Kane. She opened her briefcase and removed a stack of documents, arranging them neatly in front of her. "I'm here for the board meeting, Mr. Kane. As the second-largest shareholder of this company, I believe I have some input on the operational changes you've been implementing." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning. Kane's advisors exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. "I'm sorry," Kane said, his usual confidence noticeably shaken. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. You're a terminated employee. You have no authority here." Samantha smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Kane, I think it's time you learned about the woman you fired yesterday." She slid a document across the table toward him. "Jennifer Chen was my business partner and closest friend. When she passed away 2 years ago, she left me her shares in the company we built together. That represents 30% ownership of NexTech Solutions, which became 30% ownership of the merged entity when you acquired us." Kane stared at the document, his face growing pale as he read the legal language that confirmed Samantha's claims. "Furthermore," Samantha continued, "according to the merger agreement that your legal team negotiated, any workforce reduction affecting more than 25% of employees requires shareholder approval representing at least 60% of company equity." She gestured toward his side of the table. I have 30%, and I do not approve of your restructuring plan." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Kane's lead attorney was frantically flipping through documents, trying to find some loophole or contradiction, but Samantha had done her homework thoroughly. "This is impossible," Kane finally said, his voice strained. "You worked for this company. You were an employee. I was a co-founder who chose to remain involved in daily operations rather than step back into a purely ownership role," Samantha replied. "Jennifer and I built this company from nothing. We mortgaged our homes, worked 18-hour days, and sacrificed everything to create the products and culture that made NexTech successful." She leaned forward, her gaze intensifying. "Yesterday, you fired me without even knowing who I was. You dismissed 8 years of my contributions as redundancy. You treated me like an expendable line item in your cost-cutting spreadsheet." Kane's advisors were whispering urgently among themselves, but Samantha wasn't finished. Let me tell you what you actually fired yesterday, Mr. Kane. You fired the person who designed the user interface for NexTech's flagship product, the one that generates 40% of the company's revenue. You fired the team leader who developed the client relationship management system that every Fortune 500 company wants to license. You fired the co-founder who spent 2 years negotiating the partnerships that account for 60% of our annual contracts. She paused, letting her words sink in. In essence, you fired the person who built the company you thought you were smart enough to improve. David Chen, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Mr. Kane, I should mention that the other employees you terminated yesterday were personally recruited and trained by Samantha. They represent some of the most talented developers and project managers in the industry. Most of them have already received job offers from competitors. Kane's jaw worked silently, as if he were trying to find words that wouldn't come. Samantha reached into her briefcase and removed another document. This is a formal motion to reverse all terminations implemented yesterday and to restructure the current management approach. As a 30% shareholder, I'm entitled to call for a vote on this motion. You can't do this, Kane said, his voice rising slightly. I own this company. No, Mr. Kane, you own 51% of this company, and 51% isn't enough to override the concerns of the other shareholders. Samantha's voice remained calm, professional. The company you purchased wasn't just a collection of assets and contracts. It was built on relationships, innovation, and institutional knowledge that can't be replaced by hiring cheaper employees. She stood up, walking around the table to where Kane sat. You made a fundamental error in judgment. You assumed that ownership means you can disregard the people who created the value you purchased. You assumed that cutting costs was more important than understanding what you won't. Kane looked up at her, his expression a mixture of anger and grudging respect. What do you want? I want you to reinstate every employee you terminated yesterday. I want you to meet with each department head to understand their operations before making changes. And I want you to acknowledge that this company's success comes from its people, not from your spreadsheet. The room was completely silent. Kane's advisors waited for his response, their expressions carefully neutral. And if I refuse? Kane asked. Samantha returned to her seat and opened another folder. Then I call for a vote of no confidence in your leadership. As a 30% shareholder, I can demand a review of your operational decisions. I can also exercise my right to audit all financial decisions made since the acquisition. She paused, her gaze steady. I suspect your other investors might be very interested in learning how you've been managing their money. Kane stared at her for a long moment, then looked around the table at his advisors. Finally, he spoke. Miss Williams, you've made your point quite effectively. I prefer Williams, actually, and I'm not trying to make a point. I'm trying to save a company that I've dedicated my career to building. Kane nodded slowly. What would you suggest as a path forward? Samantha opened her briefcase one more time and removed a thick document. I've prepared a comprehensive operational review that maintains efficiency while preserving the institutional knowledge and relationships that make this company valuable. She slid the document across the table. It includes reinstatement of all terminated employees, a restructured reporting hierarchy that utilizes existing expertise, and a timeline for implementing changes that won't disrupt client relationships. Kane picked up the document, scanning the first few pages. Despite himself, he was impressed by the thoroughness and professionalism of the proposal. This would cost significantly more than my original plan, he said. Yes, Samantha agreed. But it would also preserve the revenue streams and client relationships that your plan would have destroyed. Sometimes the most expensive option is actually the most economical in the long run. Kane continued reading, his expression gradually shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. After several minutes, he looked up. Ms. Williams, this is actually quite impressive. Your analysis of the cost-benefit ratios is more sophisticated than what my own team provided. That's because I know this company inside and out. I know which clients are considering expansion, which products are in development, and which employees are critical to maintaining our competitive advantage. Kane set the document down and leaned back in his chair. I owe you an apology, and I owe this company a better approach to leadership. Apologies are appreciated, but actions matter more, Samantha replied. Are you prepared to implement these recommendations? Kane looked around the table at his advisors, then back at Samantha. I have one condition, which is, I want you to return to the company, not as an employee, but as Chief Operating Officer, reporting directly to me. Your insights are clearly invaluable, and I'd rather have you working with me than against me. Samantha considered the offer carefully. I'll accept, but I have conditions of my own. First, all employees terminated yesterday are reinstated with full back pay and a formal apology. Second, all future operational changes affecting more than 10% of the workforce must be approved by the board. Third, I want a commitment to maintaining the company culture and values that made NexTech successful. Kane extended his hand across the table. Deal. As they shook hands, Kane said, Ms. Williams, I have to admit, this is not how I expected my week to go. Samantha smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in it. Mr. Kane, in my experience, the best business outcomes come from the unexpected moments when we're forced to see things differently. 6 months later, NexTech Solutions had not only recovered from the turbulent acquisition period, but had thrived under the new leadership structure. Samantha's operational expertise, combined with Kane's strategic vision and resources, had created a dynamic partnership that drove innovation and growth. The company's revenue had increased by 35%, 3 new products had been launched successfully, and employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. The story of the acquisition and subsequent turnaround had become a case study in business schools, highlighting the importance of understanding company culture and valuing institutional knowledge. Marcus Kane had learned to appreciate the difference between cutting costs and creating value, while Samantha had discovered that sometimes the best way to protect what you've built is to fight for it directly. On a Friday evening, as they reviewed quarterly reports in the conference room where their confrontation had taken place 6 months earlier, Kane looked across the table at his partner. Samantha, can I ask you something? Of course. When you walked in here that day, did you know how it was going to end? Samantha leaned back in her chair, considering the question. I knew I had the legal authority to challenge your decisions, but honestly, I wasn't sure if you'd be willing to listen or if you'd dig in and fight. What made you think it was worth trying? Jennifer used to say that the best business relationships come from moments of conflict that get resolved through mutual respect rather than one side defeating the other. Samantha gestured around the room. This company represents the dreams and hard work of a lot of people. It was worth fighting for. Kane nodded thoughtfully. I'm glad you did, not just for the company, but for me personally. I learned more about leadership in that one meeting than I had in the previous 5 years. As they packed up their materials and prepared to leave for the weekend, Samantha reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. She thought about Jennifer, who would have been proud to see how the company had evolved and grown. She thought about the employees who had been reinstated and were now thriving in an environment that valued their contributions. And she thought about the importance of standing up for what you believe in, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon in business isn't money or connections or even brilliant strategy. Sometimes, it's simply the courage to say, you're wrong, and here's why. Marcus Kane had learned that lesson the hard way, but he had learned it well, and in the process, both he and Samantha had discovered that the best business partnerships often begin with the most challenging conversation. The story of their confrontation and subsequent collaboration became legendary in tech industry circles, not just for its dramatic resolution, but for what it represented about the value of fighting for what you believe in and the power of turning conflict into collaboration. As Samantha often told young entrepreneurs who sought her advice, never underestimate the importance of knowing your worth and being prepared to defend it. And never underestimate the possibility that your biggest challenge might become your greatest opportunity.